The Checkpoint is presented by GM Pharma, the first international multinational pharmaceutical company in Georgia. GM Pharma, to serve those who need it most.
On the occasion of the Asian Development Bank's ADB's 55th annual meeting, both BMG and Forbes Georgia were invited to a virtual media briefing on ADB's work in Central and West Asia, which included Georgia as well. Mariam Varadashvili represented BMG and I represented Forbes Georgia. Here's a brief recap of the main aspects emphasized by our platforms.
According to your update outlook, high growth of Georgian economy is mainly driven by migrants and money transfers from Russia. What's your opinion on how long this positive effect may continue on the Georgian economy if we take into account the fact that there are clear signs that the Russian economy will head for recession? And also, what's your advice to Georgian government? What will do in order to keep high economic growth after when this positive effect end? Thank you.
Thank you, Mariam. I think this is also building up on the previous question. Indeed, I was just talking about the impact of Russian migrants, the first wave, the second wave, and so on. I also wanted to say that, you did mention the increased number of money transfers from Russian and those money which are brought by the Russian citizens. So I think in Georgia, in the first 7 months, actually the amount of, we call it personal money transfers, increased by 70%, which is a very large number. Specifically from Russia, just from a few months between April and July, these personal money transfers increased by 6 times. So, you know, it's a big impact on the economy of Georgia, obviously. How long will this process will continue? Is it a one-time effect on the economy, or is it something that we are going to see? I mean, we wish all to have answers to these questions. We don't. But as I said, as economists, we look at data, we look at number. We also, you know, watch things which are not tangible, like business confidence in the economy, uncertainty, because of course, these factors, they affect decision-making of businesses and so on. So, you know, we already upgraded in our outlook inflationary pressures, because I said this is one factor, which of course affects real incomes of households, of Georgians, first of all, in the country. So you also asked about, before that, I also wanted to say the effect of migrants' remittances, even though Georgia is not as dependent on remittances as, say, other countries in our region like Tajikistan or Kyrgyz Republic, but still, if Georgian citizens who work in Russia, if they are also coming back, returning, we expect remittances also to decline. And also these effects have on exchange rate, on the currency strength, and so on. But I think you ask in the second part of your question a very good point of what the government should be doing. What is the policy really? And as always, we economists, we try to focus and to advise governments to focus on fundamental things, on systemic things. So whatever will happen with wave of migration, you know, this is still sort of like a temporary thing. I don't expect this is really coming, you know, through so many years. But if the government will focus on fundamental things, and Georgia is doing so well in all these business-friendly reforms, investment climate. So if the government will maintain this very strong business-friendly stance, not only that, but also macroeconomic stability. For example, I think Georgian public debt to GDP is fairly good. I mean, comparing with some other countries, I think it's about 47%. So macroeconomic stability, focus on entrepreneurial development, on business climate. Georgia has always been a good example for all our countries and other governments. And that will keep you on track for steady, sustainable economic growth. Thank you.
Let me quickly supplement Laziza's response. As you mentioned, some of these changes are transitory. Some of them can be a bit more long-term. Just one example, the development of so-called middle transport corridor. Many countries in the region are now trying to diversify the trading routes. And one particular corridor that investors in the countries are looking at is the middle corridor, so-called middle corridor, transferring the goods from the Central Asia through Caspian Sea to Georgia, Turkey, and onwards to Europe, and in the opposite direction. So I think this is one of the areas where the governments in the region can also look at possible enhancement of investments and reap kind of longer-term benefits. One more area I would mention in the area of structural reform in the Republic of Georgia, and this is one of the areas where we have been working with the government quite a lot. This is the reform of the state-owned enterprises. I think this is another area where the government should pay a bit more attention.
Thank you for this opportunity, and thank you for a very interesting overview and presentation that you presented. I represent Forbes in Georgia. I will have two very brief questions. First question is about one of the very important points that you had in your presentation. You mentioned that health sector is underfunded in the region, and it is below, the funding is below recommended 5% of GDP. Why does that focus on funding health sector still persists? Because due to pandemic, also due to this war and economic hardships, I mean, deficits in most countries are quite high. So what would be your recommendation? How should this be balanced so that there is more funds available for the health sector? Because that seems quite a dilemma for not rich countries, let me say so. And then my second very brief question goes to the EU candidate status for Georgia. You briefly mentioned some of the fundamentals. Do you think that those 12 reforms that have been underlined for Georgia also count for those fundamentals that you mentioned, and would that boost investor confidence that you also said? Because what we see after the pandemic, we see this coordinated effort from different IFIs, from different development partners for the countries. Would that also help you in having priorities for Georgia in this specific situation? Thank you.
Yeah, I'll take this question. Thank you, Elaine. And I think you are raising a very, very important question regarding health system. And of course, if anything, the pandemic showed how underfunded in many countries in our region, and sometimes inefficient public health systems are, and how important it is to continue reforming, funding the system. This links to a more broader question on revenue mobilization on the fiscal side, and domestic resource mobilization, what we call in ADB DRM. And our President Massa of ADB is putting a lot of efforts, a lot of focus on domestic resource mobilization of our countries. When it comes to public health systems and its funding, it's not only an issue of revenues, I would say, it's also an issue of efficiency of existing expenditures that we spend on hospitals, on funding of clinics, on also education of doctors and so on. ADB is working very closely with all our development member countries, including in our region, in CWRD, on improving efficiency of public health systems, but also working on the fiscal side, really trying to boost domestic resource mobilization. And I know in Georgia, it's a little bit unique country because In your country, you cannot just, governments cannot, or cabinet of ministers cannot just raise taxes. You have a special legal process to go through that. So in this situation, focusing on efficiency of public health spending and efficiency of fiscal expenditures on health in the first place, but also on education and our social spending is very, very important. For your second question on 12 reforms and the importance of investor confidence, building up good atmosphere, good environment for businesses. Of course, I mentioned earlier, it's extremely important. And in this case, I think, again, Georgia is a little bit different because you have a deep and comprehensive trade agreement with European Union. And under that platform, under that framework, the country is, and the government is also adhering to very important business climate reforms. So this is very important. And I think Georgia actually can be an example, a model for other countries in the region in pursuing these business reforms. You also mentioned coordination with other international organizations and among ourselves, and we have a very strong coordination of IFIs or bilateral donors also in the region.
Some other relevant questions that have been posed on a virtual media briefing with the emphasis on Georgia mainly touched upon the sustainability of Georgia's economic growth in the long run due to the migration influx from Russia. Here's ADB's take on some of the related issues.
I think on the impact of this current wave of migrants on inflation, well, it's for a country like Georgia, you don't have a really large population, and it's a fairly small open economy. So any shock to the country is quite significant, right? It's sizable. So from the inflow of people coming, in thousands, as we understand as of now, these people, they will have to live somewhere. They will have to buy food. So because of that, there will be pressure, sort of like what we call on aggregate demand, right? So there is this inflow of additional people can be considered as a shock to aggregate demand, if we use macroeconomic terms. So there will be a higher pressure on purchases of food items, on services. These people have to live somewhere. They have to rent. So I already heard that students in Georgia, but frankly speaking, in many other countries also, they are already facing a more challenging situation because of increased rents in Tbilisi, for example. But let's not forget, as an economist, that inflation is not just a one-time hike in prices. Inflation is a persistent rise in price level. So again, as I said, there is a lot of uncertainty, and we cannot really say with sure or with certainty that we expect inflation to go up. Having said that, I also would like to mention that compared to our earlier forecast of inflation in Georgia for this year, that was in March when we released our ADO, Asian Development Outlook. We thought inflation would be at around 7%. Now we upgraded it sharply, to 11%. You mentioned that already. And again, the pressure on prices is coming on foods. And of course, Georgia, let's not forget, is an energy importing country. And with all these high oil prices, gas prices, the pressure on energy market and energy products is still there. So on your second question on recommendations, I think, for the government, if I just go very quickly, I mean, I can talk a lot on that, but very briefly, I think Eugene earlier mentioned the need for continuing reform with SOEs, state-owned enterprises. And you do have actually quite a lot of them still in Georgia, and they are really the issue on governance, on separation of ownership and commercialization of enterprises, business improvement of business. So like really making state-owned enterprises behaving and operating as a private commercial enterprises. That is one area. Not only SOEs, but also state-owned banks. I think it's also, even though you don't have a lot. Of course, the need for funding of infrastructure is very important. And in general, I think Georgia is located in such a wonderful kind of location in the middle of South Caucasus and at the crossroads of, north, south, east, west, you name it. So regional cooperation is extremely important. And this kind of routine work, sometimes it's not really seen visibly, but routine work on standardizing, unifying maybe technical standards is very important, because this is the things that make life for real businesses easier. And I know that ADB is now working on a new new project on border crossing points between Azerbaijan and Georgia. So something interesting for the first time in the region. We are doing that, and we hope it will be a very good pilot. Was it something else? No, I think all right, thanks.
Thanks, Lisa. Let me quickly just add on infrastructure. I think, as Lisa mentioned, the investment infrastructure is very important for a country like Georgia to maximize its trade and transit potential. And ADB is very proud to be associated with some of the very important projects in this sector in Georgia. I'm talking specifically about North-South corridor, transport corridor, also East-West transport corridor. In March of this year, I was lucky to be able to make a trip and drive from Tbilisi to Gori to take a look at the project which is being implemented with the assistance from the Asian Development Bank. And we've seen quite tremendous progress which was being made on that road, despite the 2 years of COVID restrictions. So we hope that by 2024, when Georgia will be hosting the annual general meeting of the Asian Development Bank, a large portion of that highway would be completed, and the residents of Georgia will be able to enjoy it.
The Checkpoint is presented by GM Pharma, the first international multinational pharmaceutical company in Georgia. GM Pharma, to serve those who need it most.